Welcome back. In this module, we're talking about poverty and wealth, Macionis Chapter 2. So, how do we define poverty? What is the poverty line like in the U.S.? Quite simply, living in poverty means not having enough money to provide for basic necessities of life food, clothing, and shelter. But this is also somewhat a matter of opinion. Some would say that one is impoverished if he or she cannot afford things like health care, educational resources not provided by the public schools, which we'll cover more later in the course, transportation to get to and from work, etc. The U.S. government defines poverty by looking at the poverty line, also known as the poverty threshold. For example, according to the U.S. Census Bureau in 2013, the poverty line stood at $11,490 for one person and $23,550 for a family of four. Adjusted for inflation, these dollar figures have been relatively stable over the last 40 years, but the percentage of households living below these lines have changed over the years. Macionis talks more about this in the middle of Chapter 2. Where do we get the concept of the poverty line? This comes from Molly Orshansky in 1965. She developed the line as 3 times the amount spent on food. This came from studies in the 50s, very old by today's standards, where a survey of families considered to be poor were found to have spent about 1/3 of their incomes on food. Now, the government uses the Thrifty Food Plan, the amount determined as the cost of a subsistence level diet, and then they multiply that by 3. That amount is the poverty line. However, currently, research is pushing for changes in measurement of poverty by looking not at food times 3, but at the actual cost of living food, clothing, shelter, including utilities, and a small additional amount to allow for other needs, for example, household supplies, personal care, non work related transportation. How do sociologists explain poverty? The functionalist perspective is that this is an equitable reward system. We pay people for the quality or the value of the work they do. Now, this has largely fallen out of favor in contemporary sociological analyses because the value of the work someone does is a relative term. For instance, our society does not pay garbage collectors very well. According to structural functionalism, this would be a reflection that we do not value the work they do. However, have you ever been in a city or seen a city where sanitation workers have gone on strike? It is a complete mess, and it stinks. Without such workers, disease would run rampant, the smell would be overbearing, etc. They are highly valued, but we don't pay them as such. In the conflict theory explanation, poor people have limited access to the resources necessary to get out of being poor. What do you think would limit someone's ability to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, as the saying goes? For example, access to childcare, education, clothing. People have varying levels of social capital and cultural capital. You know how to behave in different situations, like in a job interview, how to impress your boss, which fork to use for which course of the meal, how to talk baseball with a baseball fan, or to talk music with a music fan. People who have these kinds of capital are more likely to get and keep good jobs. Where do they learn most of this stuff? From their parents, who also had that capital. This is a cycle known as class reproduction. Now, the class system in the U.S. is constantly reinforced by people having the knowledge necessary to move around mostly just in the class they were born into and educated in. You want to get a loan? You have to know how to impress the bankers. Let them know you're good for it. You want to get a good job? You have to have the clothes, the attitude, know how to talk about a good wine at dinner or sports in the interview or politics. What if you can't afford a newspaper or TV? You don't have internet access, and so on. How about dialect? It's not just a black and white problem, but what about Southern accents? Certain patterns of speech, certain accents are often construed as reflections of a person's ability. What have we done to reduce poverty? Shifting gears a little bit here. Before the turn of the 20th century, poverty was considered a local problem with local solutions. And then came the Great Depression. The 1930s saw 25% unemployment, with little job security, low wages, and no benefits for the other 75%. So Franklin D. Roosevelt instituted the New Deal based on Keynesian economics that government spending could help to control the severity of fluctuations in the economy. Furthermore, in times of economic hardship, government spending could help jumpstart the economy, prime the pump, according to Roosevelt. So the New Deal instituted government jobs programs, Social Security, unemployment insurance, housing subsidies, and AFDC, assistance for families with dependent children. The Great Society came along with Lyndon Johnson, Economic Opportunity Act of 1964. That was the first formal campaign against poverty. Johnson's programs added funds to AFDC, Social Security, and housing subsidies, also added services such as Medicaid and Medicare, Head Start, the ESEA, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, and Job Corps. In 2008, George W. Bush instituted the Troubled Asset Relief Program, TARP, to provide assistance to failing banks and the American International Group, the largest insurer in the world. In 2009, Barack Obama instituted the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, or ARA, to provide investment in infrastructure, roads, bridges, airports, etc., education, refurbish old school buildings, build new buildings, and research into alternative energy. The idea behind ARA is also to save or create jobs by hiring people to work on those roads and build new schools and start new energy research firms, etc. But why are our efforts to eradicate poverty failing? Poverty is a structural problem. It has much less to do with the poor lacking certain values and much more to do with a lack of education and training, to do with racism, sexism, particularly against single mothers, and little, if any, government assistance to help the poor climb out of the pit they're in. In order to eliminate structural problems, solutions must be enacted for years, decades, maybe even centuries. For example, racism is a structural problem in many ways, which after 40 years or 100 years or 300 years still hasn't been eliminated. But voters are typically very short-sighted in what they will agree to let the government fund. If they don't see results quickly, they tend to shift the direction by changing the party in power in Congress, voting in a new president, etc. Poverty programs have been seen as band-aid solutions, that it was just the bad luck or bad values of these few people, so we get them assistance and back to work, we won't have to worry about them again. One generation, maybe two, tops, for new values to be passed on to the children and we'll be done with it. Unfortunately, that hasn't worked. There's more to the problem than just teaching the next generation the value of hard work. So that's it for this video cast. Make sure you read through Chapter 2, and then I'll see you online.